Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Wisdom of the Myths, How Greek Mythology Can Change Your Life, by Luc Ferry, narrated by Bob Souer. Prologue. Greek Mythology. For whom? For what? Let us begin with beginnings. What is the underlying purpose of the Greek myths, and why today, more than ever perhaps, should we pay attention to them? I believe the answer lies in a single passage of what is perhaps the most celebrated work of ancient Greece, the Odyssey of Homer, in which we see clearly the extent to which mythology is not what we so often think of it as being, an accumulation of tales and legends, a collection of anecdotes more or less fantastical, whose sole end is to amuse us. Far from being reducible to literary entertainment, mythology is at the core of ancient wisdom, the foundation for that great edifice of Greek philosophy that would subsequently sketch out, in conceptual form, the blueprint of a successful life for humankind, mortal as we are. Let us allow ourselves to be carried along for a moment on the tide of Homer's story, whose broad outlines I recall here, but which we shall have reason to revisit later on. After 10 long years of absence fighting the Trojans, Odysseus, Greek hero par excellence, has won the day by cunning, thanks, of course, to the famous wooden horse that he left so ambiguously on the beach outside the city ramparts. It is the Trojans themselves who wheel it into their citadel, otherwise unassailable for the Greeks. They take it to be an offering to the gods, whereas it is a war machine whose ribs are packed with soldiers. Night falls, the Greek warriors emerge from the belly of this imposing statue and proceed to massacre the sleeping Trojans, down to the last man, more or less. It is an appalling and merciless carnage, pillage so dreadful as to excite even the anger of the gods. But at least the war is now over. Odysseus can think of returning home to his island, Ithaca, to his wife, Penelope, his son, Telemachus. In short, he can reassume his place in the family and at the heart of the kingdom. We observe already that before reaching its destination in this harmonious fashion, in peaceful reconciliation with things as they are, the existence of Odysseus, like that of the universe as a whole, begins in chaos. The terrible war in which he has taken part, which has forced him unwillingly to quit the natural place he occupied beside his loved ones, takes place under the auspices of Eris, goddess of strife and discord. It is on her account that enmity first took root between Greeks and Trojans, and it is in the perspective of this initial conflict that the hero's itinerary must be placed if we are to grasp its significance as wisdom literature. The dispute erupts over a marriage, that of the future parents of Achilles, himself a Greek hero, and one of the major protagonists of the Trojan War. As in the tale of Sleeping Beauty, everyone has forgotten to invite the wicked stepmother, or rather, Eris, who plays that role in this story. This is to say that they deliberately pass over her on this festive occasion. Wherever she appears, everything is sure to turn to gall. Sooner or later, hatred and anger always manage to prevail over love and joy. Naturally, Eris, the uninvited, turns up, intent on disturbing the proceedings. She comes fully armed with an apple, which she casts onto the table where the newlyweds are feasting, surrounded for the occasion by the principal gods of Olympus. On this magnificent golden apple are inscribed the words, "For the fairest." As is to be expected, all of the women present exclaim in unison, "It's mine," and the conflict insinuates itself slowly but surely that will, in due course, spark the Trojan War. And here is how. Around the banquet table are seated 3 magnificent goddesses, all equally precious to Zeus, ruler of the gods. Firstly, Hera, Juno in Latin, his immortal wife, to whom he can refuse nothing. but also present are his favorite daughter, Athena, Minerva, and his aunt, Aphrodite, Venus, goddess of love and of beauty. As is to be expected, Eris's plot works its course, and the three women all claim the golden apple. Zeus, as head of the family, refrains as far as possible from taking sides in the quarrel. He is well aware that, having to choose between his daughter, his wife, and his aunt, he would have no peace. Moreover, he must act impartially, and whatever his choice, he will be accused of prejudice by those he rules against. So he sends his faithful messenger, Hermes, Mercury, to discreetly seek out some young innocent to adjudicate between the three beauties. At first sight, the young man in question appears to be a Trojan shepherd, but is in reality none other than Paris, one of the sons of Priam, king of Troy. Paris was abandoned at birth because an oracle predicted that he would cause the destruction of his native city. But he was rescued in the nick of time and his life saved by a shepherd. The latter took pity on this infant and raised him to be the handsome adolescent who now stands before them. So, in the guise of a young peasant, there is concealed a Trojan prince. With the ingenuousness of youth, Paris accepts the role of judge. Each of the women, to claim his attention and secure the famous apple of discord, promises Paris something corresponding to what she is herself. Hera, who reigns by the side of Zeus over the greatest of empires, namely the entire universe, promises, if he chooses her, that he likewise will rule over all earthly lands and have preeminent wealth. Athena, goddess of intelligence, of the arts, and of warfare, promises that if she emerges victorious, he will be conqueror in every battle. As for Aphrodite, she whispers to him that with her help he can seduce the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, of course, decides in favor of Aphrodite, and then discovers, to the misery of mortals everywhere, that the most beautiful woman in the world is in fact married to a Greek. Not merely a Greek, but Menelaus, king of Sparta, the most warlike of all cities. She is called Helen, the famous Belle Hélène, to whom poets, composers, and chefs have continued to pay tribute down the ages. Eris has attained her objective. A Trojan prince, Paris, charmed by Aphrodite, abducts the beautiful Helen from Menelaus, and the inevitable war between Trojans and Greeks is unleashed a few years later. And poor Odysseus will be forced to play his part in it. The Greek kings, of whom Odysseus is one since he rules over Ithaca, have in effect taken an oath to uphold the marriage rights of whoever marries Helen. Her beauty and charms are such, it is feared that jealousy on her account, fueled by hatred, will sow discord between the kings. They have therefore sworn allegiance to whomever Helen selects. Menelaus being the chosen one, all the others must, in the event of any betrayal, come to his assistance. Odysseus, whose wife Penelope has just given birth to little Telemachus, does all he can to avoid this war. He pretends to be demented. He plows his fields back to front. He sows pebbles instead of good grain. But his ruse fails to deceive the wise old sage who is dispatched to seek him out, and in the end Odysseus must resign himself to sailing with the others. For 10 long years he is separated from his natural place, from his world, from his home in the universe, from his loved ones, dedicated to conflict and discord rather than to harmony and peace. Once the war is over, he has but one idea in his head. He wants to get home. But his troubles are only beginning. His return voyage will last 10 long years and will be full of pitfalls, almost insurmountable trials that suggest that an ordered existence, personal salvation, and the path to wisdom are not to be taken for granted in this world. We have to earn them at the risk sometimes of life itself. It is at the very outset of his return voyage, his journey from war toward peace, that the episode that now concerns us takes place. Odysseus and Calypso. A successful life on this earth is preferable to a wasted immortality. Striving to reach Ithaca, Odysseus must stop off on the island of Calypso, who is a minor divinity but nonetheless ravishingly beautiful and endowed with supernatural powers. Calypso falls hopelessly in love with Odysseus. In short order she seduces him and makes up her mind to hold him captive. In Greek, her name derives from the verb kaluptein, to hide. She is as beautiful as the day is long. Her island is paradisal, lush, inhabited by creatures and fruit trees that provide exquisite nourishment. The climate is soft. The resident nymphs who take care of the two lovers are beautiful and obliging. It would seem that the goddess holds all the cards, and yet Odysseus is drawn irresistibly toward his own corner of the world, toward Ithaca. He must at all costs return to his point of departure, and every evening he weeps as he looks out to sea in despair of ever reaching it. But he fails to reckon on the intervention of Athena, who, for her own reasons, which include jealousy that the Trojan Paris did not choose her, has been supporting the Greeks throughout the war. Seeing Odysseus in the grip of such torments, she asks her father Zeus to send Hermes, his messenger, to command Calypso to release him so that he may find his natural place and live in harmony, finally, with the cosmic order, of which the ruler of the gods is, after all, both author and guarantor. But Calypso has one more trump up her sleeve. In a final desperate attempt to keep her lover, she offers him the impossible, as far as any human life is concerned, the chance to escape death, the common lot of mortals, and to enter the inaccessible sphere of those whom the Greeks refer to as the blessed, which is to say, the gods themselves. For good measure, she enhances her proposal with a far from negligible bonus. If Odysseus says yes, he will be forever endowed not only with immortality but also with the beauty and strength that are the exclusive attributes of youth. This additional clause is both important and amusing. If Calypso specifies youth as well as immortality, it is because she is remembering a slightly awkward precedent, one that involved another goddess, Aurora, who also fell in love with an ordinary mortal, a Trojan by the name of Tithonus. Like Calypso, Aurora wanted to make her lover immortal so as never to be separated from him. She begged Zeus, who granted her wish, but she forgot to ask him to confer youth as well as immortality upon her beloved. The result, over the course of time, the unfortunate Tithonus cruelly wasted away and shriveled up until he became a desiccated husk, a sort of revolting insect that Aurora finally abandoned in a corner of her palace before deciding to transform him into a cicada so as to rid herself of him completely. This is why Calypso's request is so specific. She loves Odysseus enough not to want him either to die or to grow old. The conflict between love and death, as in all the great stories of salvation or of wisdom, is at the heart of our story. The proposition that Calypso dangles before Odysseus is irresistible, as is she herself, as is her island, an unprecedented offer for any mortal. To all of which, almost incomprehensibly, Odysseus remains unmoved. As unhappy as ever, he declines the goddess's uniquely tempting proposition. Let us be quite clear from the start. The refusal is of epical significance. It contains, in nucleo, what is undoubtedly the most powerful and profound lesson of Greek mythology, which will subsequently be adopted by Greek philosophy for its own purposes, and which can be summarized as follows. The ultimate end of human existence is not, as the Christians further down the line would come to believe, to secure eternal salvation by all available means, including the most morally submissive and tedious, to attain immortality. On the contrary, a mortal life well lived is worth far more than a wasted immortality. In other words, the conviction of Odysseus is that the diasporic or displaced life, the life lived far from home and therefore without structure, outside one's natural orbit, in the wrong part of the cosmos, is quite simply worse than death itself. What Odysseus's refusal contains in a nutshell is a definition of the life well lived, from which we begin to glimpse the philosophical dimension of the myth. Following Odysseus, we must learn to prefer a condition of mortality in accord with cosmic dispensation, as against an immortal life doomed to what the Greeks termed hubris, the immoderation that estranges us from reconciliation to and acceptance of the world as it is. We must live in a state of lucidity, accepting death, accepting what we are and what is beyond us, in step with our people and with the universe. This is worth far more than immortality in a vacuum, denuded of meaning, however paradisal, with a woman we do not love, however perfect she may be, far from our own kind and from our hearth, in an isolation symbolized not only by Calypso's island itself, but also by the temptations of deification and eternity that estrange us in equal measure from what we are and from what surrounds us. It is an inestimable lesson in wisdom for a secular age such as ours today, a lesson that breaks step with the logic of monotheisms past and future, and that philosophy will translate into the language of reason, with its doctrines of salvation without a God, and of the good life for ordinary mortals such as we are. Clearly, we must investigate further the motives for Odysseus's refusal. We shall hear throughout this book how the major Greek myths illustrate, develop, and confirm, each after its fashion, the sovereign truth of this refusal, and furnish philosophy with a basis for its future development. But let us first draw some conclusions from this initial engagement with Greek myth before stating the premises of our investigation as a whole. As a starting point, can we explain how a group of myths invented more than 3,000 years ago in a language and culture with almost no connection to those in which we are immersed today can nevertheless speak to us with such force and intimacy? Each year, throughout the world, dozens of new books on Greek mythology are published. For a long time, films, animated cartoons, and TV series have routinely raided classical culture for the plots of their screenplays. All of us have at some point encountered the labors of Hercules, the travels of Odysseus, the loves of Zeus, or the War of Troy. I think there are two sets of explanations for this. Cultural explanations naturally, but also, and even to a greater degree, philosophical explanations, which I would like to raise in this prologue. In this respect, the present work can be seen as directly extending the investigation opened by my earlier A Brief History of Thought, Volume 1 of Learning to Live. I have tried to retell in the simplest and liveliest terms the principal stories of Greek mythology, but I have done so within a particular philosophical perspective about which I should say a few words. In attempting to bring out the lessons in wisdom concealed within these narratives, I will try to explore the continued relevance of the myriad stories and anecdotes usually grouped together in more or less jumbled fashion under the name of mythology, in order to better isolate what speaks to us so immediately in these tales of time past. I would like to suggest, first of all, what our culture owes to them. In the name of culture, why we, too, are ancient Greeks. Let us begin with our broad cultural inheritance of Greek myths. Consider for a moment that many everyday images, figures of speech, and expressions are directly borrowed without our knowing their meaning or origin. Some commonplaces bear the memory trace of a mythical or fabulous episode, usually the crisis point in the adventures of a god or hero, to go off in search of the golden fleece, to take the bull by the horns, to fall between Scylla and Charybdis, to introduce a Trojan horse to our enemies, to cleanse the Augean stables, to follow Ariadne's thread, to have an Achilles heel, to feel nostalgia for a golden age, to place our efforts under the shield or aegis of someone, to look up at the Milky Way, to take part in the Olympic Games. Other usages, more numerous still, allude to the dominant trait of a personality, the name for which is familiar to us often without our understanding the reason nor the role it originally played in the Greek imagination, to describe an utterance as Sibylline, to be confronted with an apple of discord, to play at Cassandra, to have, like Telemachus in Odyssey, a mentor, to sink into the arms of Morpheus, or to take morphine, to be blessed or cursed with a Midas touch, to lose oneself in a labyrinth of alleyways, to have a Soci or double named after the servant of Amphitryon whose appearance was borrowed by Hermes when Zeus descended to seduce Alcmene, to be endowed with Titanic or Herculean strength, to suffer the torments of Tantalus, to be stretched on a Procrustean bed, to be a Pygmalion in love with his creation, or a Sybarite, like the effeminately luxurious inhabitants of the city of Sybaris, to consult an Atlas, to swear like a Carter, to embark on a Promethean undertaking, or upon an endless task akin to pushing a Sisyphean boulder, to pass a ferocious concierge or Cerberus on the stairs, to speak with a stentorian voice, to cut the Gordian knot, or ride Amazon style, to imagine chimeras, to be petrified as if by a Medusa, to spring fully formed as if from the head of Zeus, to be chased by a harpy or fury, to give way to panic, to open unwittingly a Pandora's box of troubles, to have an Oedipus complex, to be a narcissist. The list could be extended indefinitely. In the same fashion, are we sufficiently aware in our everyday usage that a hermaphrodite is literally the offspring of Hermes, messenger of the gods, and Aphrodite, goddess of love? Or that Gorgon refers to a plant that looks petrified as if it has met the gaze of Medusa? That museum and music derive from the 9 sacred muses? That a lynx supposedly derives its keen sight from Lynceus, the Argonaut of whom it was said that he could see through an oak plank? That Echo, the nymph, still makes us hear her desolate cry at the loss of Narcissus, so long after her own disappearance? That the laurel is a tree sacred to the memory of Daphne, and the cypress, which can be found in so many Mediterranean cemeteries, is a symbol of mourning that remembers the unfortunate Cyparissus, who accidentally killed his companion, a tamed stag, as it lay sleeping in the woods, and whose grief was such that it transformed him into a cypress tree. Numerous expressions likewise recall the famous sites of mythology: the Champs-Élysées, Elysian fields, or more remotely the Bosphorus, which literally means river passage for oxen, bous, ox, plus poros, means of fording a river, ferry, but which is in fact a recollection of Io, the little nymph whom Hera pursued with her jealous hatred after her illustrious husband Zeus transformed his mistress into a charming heifer to protect her from the wrath of his wife. In effect, we would need an entire book to do justice to all the mythological allusions embedded and then forgotten inside everyday language, to restore life to names such as Ocean, Triton, Python, and the other marvelous beings who inhabit our everyday language incognito. Charles Perlman, one of the great linguists of the last century, put it nicely when he spoke of the sleeping metaphors in our mother tongues. What Englishman still remembers that lunatic means moonstruck, and what Frenchman remembers as he grumbles about his mislaid lunettes, spectacles, that he is searching for little moons? One needs to be a foreigner to see these concealed features of a particular language, which is why a Japanese or an Indian often finds poetry in a term or a formula that seems to us perfectly ordinary, just as we find the transliteration of the names they give their children charming or droll. Rose Pearl, Brave Bear, Morning Sunshine. One of the aims of the present book is to awaken the sleeping metaphors deriving from Greek mythology by retelling the uncanny stories that constitute their point of origin, if only for cultural reasons, so as to understand the countless legions of works of art and literature that line our museums and libraries, drawing their inspiration from these antique roots, and that remain entirely hermetic, another recollection of the god Hermes, to those unacquainted with mythology. It is worth taking the trouble and, as we shall hear, deriving the pleasure. The extraordinary linguistic afterlife of classical mythology is clearly of significance. There are deep-seated reasons for this singular phenomenon. No philosophical system, no world religion, not even the Bible can claim equivalent importance, whereby the canon of classical mythology, even where there is complete ignorance of its real sources, can claim so unshakable a presence in our common culture. No doubt this is due in the first place to the fact that it proceeds from concrete stories rather than, as with philosophy, from abstract concepts. This is why mythology can, even today, address everybody, inspiring children with as much fervor as adults, crossing not only social class and age, if conveyed sensibly, but also traversing the generations even to the present day, as it is done virtually without interruption for nearly 3 millennia. Although it was for a long time thought of as a mark of distinction, as a symbol of the highest culture, the study of mythology is by no means confined to an elite or restricted to those whose study is Latin and Greek. Like the historian Jean-Pierre Vernant, who enjoyed telling his grandson these stories, everyone can understand them, including children, who should ideally be introduced to them as early as possible. Not only does mythology bring them infinitely more than the animated cartoons they are routinely force-fed, it also profoundly illuminates their lives to come, provided that we give ourselves the trouble to understand the prodigious richness of these myths sufficiently to be able to communicate it in terms that are practical and intelligible. And here we broach one of the purposes of this book, to make classical mythology sufficiently accessible to parents so that they can in turn pass on its riches, without, however, betraying or misrepresenting the ancient texts from which these stories are drawn. This point is crucial, and I would like to dwell upon it briefly. In its aims and procedures, the present work bears no relation to the genre of popularization or retellings that are usually brought together in collections of myths and legends, in themselves perfectly enjoyable. Generally speaking, because these are intended for children as well as for a wide readership, the authors cheerfully mix together all of the heterogeneous layers and accretions that have, over the course of time, accumulated around what is thought of as the myth in question. In most cases, these disparate sources of conflicting authority are scrambled and arranged selectively for the needs of the moment. The origin and significance of the great mythic narratives are thus clouded, even falsified, to the point that they end up reduced in our memories to a collection of more or less credible anecdotes, to be placed somewhere between fairy tales and the superstitions inherited from primitive religion. Worse still, their coherence is lost beneath the ornamental frills, accretions, and errors with which modern authors cannot resist embellishing these ancient stories. In effect, we need to remember that this or that myth is by no means the work of a single author. There is no original version, no canonical or sacred text comparable to the Bible or the Quran, piously preserved through the ages, thereafter carrying authority. On the contrary, we are dealing with a plurality of stories and variants, written down by storytellers, philosophers, poets, and mythographers. Such is the term for those who assembled, collated, and edited the various compilations of myths from antiquity onward over the course of 12 centuries or more, roughly from the 7th century BC to the 5th century AD, not to mention the various oral traditions of which, by definition, we know comparatively little. This diversity cannot be reduced or dismissed on the grounds that we are not engaged in producing a work of academic authority. Although I do not address specialists in these chapters, but those of all backgrounds, I try to avoid muddle and attempt to reconcile what erudition teaches and what a readership imposes without sacrificing the first to the needs of the second. In other words, for each of the myths I indicate the original sources, quote from the most authoritative texts where possible, and specify where relevant the principal variants that emerged over the course of time. My claim is that, far from compromising the intelligibility of these stories, a respect for the ancient texts, their complexity and heterogeneity, is on the contrary the necessary condition for understanding the myths. To trace the different inflections that a tragedian like Aeschylus, 6th century BC, or a philosopher like Plato, 4th century BC, brought to the myth of Prometheus, as originally told by the poet Hesiod, 7th century BC, is to be enlightened rather than led astray. Far from obscuring these narratives, the process enriches our understanding of them. It would be absurd to deprive the listener of these clues to
Sample complete. Ready to continue?